Hi, I'm Helen Taylor from the Social Chase. I'm so excited for our guest today, Dr. Alexander Westphal. Dr. Alexander Westphal, he's an associate professor at Division of Law and Psychiatry, at the Department of Psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine. Very long-winded, but well-deserved. And he's also associate professor at Yale Child Study Center. Dr. Westphal, he's a general psychiatrist, as well as a child and adolescent and forensic psychiatrist. He's on the faculty of Yale's Division of Law and Psychiatry, as well as the Yale Child Study Center. He is particularly interested in the intersection between autism and the legal system, which is why I'm so excited to talk to him because it's so important to so many of our parents. Welcome, 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 Dr. Westphal.
Thank you so much. And it's very nice to meet you, Helen.
So I have a question as you know, many of our parents are, the first thing is we're so concerned with the legal system and our loved ones on the spectrum or special needs, and that officers not really understand, or they're not going to understand officers' commands, etc. So can you share with us, are autistic people particularly vulnerable in the legal process?
Yeah, there are a number of stages at which people with autism or autistic people can be vulnerable. And that's right out of the gates at the interface with law enforcement officers, for example. And a story you often hear is that someone, an autistic person, was engaged in, say they were in a bookstore and someone was worried about the way they were behaving or something like that. And the police come, and because neither the person nor the police know what to do with each other, the situation escalates and you end up with a kind of much more acute situation than needed to happen in the first place. And, and then you think about other aspects of the legal system when someone has actually done something wrong, or when they've been accused of doing something wrong and they're working with an attorney, or they're in front of a judge. Situations like that, there are a number of different vulnerabilities. Those are complex social exchanges, and so it makes perfect sense that difference in the way you interact socially and communicate socially impacts that process. And then you think even when someone has been found guilty of something and ends up in a kind of carceral system, like ends up in jail, there are a number of vulnerabilities there, vulnerabilities to both problematic interactions with corrections officers, but also with other inmates. And so kind of across the board, there are situations which can lead autistic people to be particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, and so that's one of the reasons why I volunteer and I train police officers to bring awareness of their interactions with somebody on the spectrum, how it's going to be different, that they're not going to comply with them as a typical person may comply, and that they shouldn't take it personal, their behaviors, because they can't help it. And one of the things that they did share with me is that, we arrest these people, they go to court, court lets them back out, and the same thing happens. It's cyclical. And it seems like to me that the court systems need training as well, as terms of when they do arrest someone, part of the legal process, are they giving them help so they don't return?
Yeah.
So I think that's an issue from what I understand.
Yeah, that's a really important issue. And getting help, but also in a sense for the legal system to have a disposition other than a kind of punishment disposition. Mm-hmm. So they need the option to be able to say, well, you did something wrong, but we understand that there are sort of complicated and mitigating circumstances. And so what we'd like to do is have you engage in treatment with this place for 6 months, or, a year, or some other option besides, a pure punishment option. And I think so often in these cases is sort of a series of misunderstandings, or sort of misunderstandings of what you can and can't do, and
right.
Sort of not reading situations correctly, or not understanding where some boundaries are. that lead to the problems, and then that's a sort of situation which is very amenable to intervention, to kind of working with someone to prevent these things from happening in the future. And I'm speaking very abstractly. There are a number of different situations I'm talking about, but I think your point that there needs to be a disposition, that there needs to be something for the legal system to direct someone to it's an important point.
So with that said, do you think that autism in law is research area? I mean, what do we need to know? I mean,
Yeah. I think it's wide open and it's poorly understood. I mean, it's obviously a huge topic because autism, the law, both there are so many different interfaces, and there's, the kind of criminal justice system, but there's also the civil system and so there's a bunch of legal issues there which have all sorts of complexities, and we ultimately know very, very little. We know very little about rates of offending. We know very little about types of offenses, why people offend when they do offend. We know very little about what happens to them afterwards. I mean, in a large chunk of the population, autism is kind of hidden by a variety of things, including socioeconomic circumstances. So people may not have had access to the kind of diagnostic resources which gave them the awareness of autism, and it may not be until they're in their 30s or their 40s that this actually gets sort of discovered. So I think that it's just a big empty sort of unknown situation, and anecdotally we know that there are a number of different concerns, a number of different problems, particularly to do with vulnerabilities, as we were talking about before. So in my opinion, it should be a real priority, because it's really like these interactions have the potential to be absolutely life-changing, for better, for worse, but often for worse. And so we really need to understand what's going on.
It's unfortunate, and it changes a person's life, not only their life, but their family's life. I mean, I've seen various instances where young men were arrested because they didn't respond to the police officer a certain way, and the police officer didn't like it. It's escalated, and this person's now get thrown in jail for like over 10 years in certain areas, and the parents are fighting for it, and they just can't get any justice for their child. And they're explaining to them that he's never been in trouble. He had autism, so he didn't know who you were, didn't know how to interact with you, or he was upset and he was having a meltdown. And officers, they don't. Some of them, don't understand, and some of them don't care. Not all. There's a lot of good officers I know, so many of them, but the ones that aren't, they are detrimental to a person who is wrongfully accused and loses their life in jail.
Yeah, no, it's a important area, in my opinion.
Yeah. So how do you approach an evaluation when someone has been referred to you as a result of like a legal issue?
Yeah. So in my little niche, people usually come to me when lawyers are involved, at the point that there's a kind of actual sort of legal case, and so I'm usually work in consultation with a lawyer in a case, and the idea is that we serve as objective kind of evaluators who can provide the legal system with kind of insight into the mental health aspects of a behavior or a case, in a non-biased way. So that's the kind of ideal of what we do, and often the situations we encounter there is a kind of open diagnostic question, So there is the question of whether autism or some other condition plays a role. There's also the kind of big question of why it's relevant, like why in the case of autism is it relevant to someone's behavior. And I think of there's this heartbreaking case of I don't know if you've heard about it, but a guy called Darius McCollum, who's a New Yorker who spent a large chunk of his life in prison, and he keeps getting arrested for taking buses or transit vehicles. And what happens is, he's completely focused on these. This is his area of special interest, and that's really sort of part of his autism and part of his identity. But it leads to kind of continuous problems with the legal system, and from the end of the legal system, they don't know quite what to do with him, because he, from their perspective, is a repeat offender who they can't sort of seem to address the kind of risk of future behaviors like this for. And so they basically, the kind of one size fits all solution is to contain him, which is in this, particularly in that case, but in so many cases, is a really tragic and sort of sad outcome. I think it's, punishment for someone who is doing something like that is so wrong to me.
Right. So is he violent on the buses, or he's just keeps taking the buses?
No.
So I would think the solution was just give him a free bus pass for the rest of his life, and then that's that.
Well, the problem, he likes to drive the buses and he likes to drive the trains,
Oh,
and he's very, very good at it. But the kind of sad irony is that he's a felon because of taking buses and taking trains.
that's his okay. That's his interest. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
And he's oft he has at times driven buses on their prescribed routes, wearing uniforms exactly as they should be driven. So this is for him. Yeah, but you
that's
can
a tough
understand.
one. How you make sure others are safe and he's safe as well, and
Yeah,
give him a job. I don't know.
so I bring that up just as an example of how an aspect of autism can a complicated legal situation.
Especially, if he's an adult, we don't know what type of services he receives early, if any, in his life.
Yeah.
And that just might be the norm from him. So he probably doesn't understand that what's he doing is not right, or it's illegal. So he just knows this is what he wants to do. And so they, so many people on the spectrum, they get on that path that this is what I want to do. So I was sharing with you earlier as a big concern of mine, amongst many things, is a couple of parents sharing with me that their sons were looking at pornography on the computer, and unfortunately the pornography they were looking at had a minor involved. One young man was a teenager, really didn't know. The FBI came banging in on this person's door to arrest their child. She was able to speak to them, explain to them that he's on the spectrum. He really didn't know. It was a big battle they had to go through, but he never did get arrested. And another situation was an adult male who was married. I think he had a family, but he was looking at pornography, which also included a minor, and the FBI came to his home and questioned him about it. He admitted that this is what he was looking at. He showed them what the site he was looking at, not really realizing that the person was a minor. The FBI said, "Thanks for your honesty," and they left, and they came back, and they ended up arresting him. The parents had to fly down to Florida to get a legal involved to try to help him out and try to explain to them that he's on autism spectrum. And it didn't matter to a case that he had to go to like federal prison. I think he went to federal prison for like 3 years, lost his family, lost a great job he had, and he's living at home now as an adult male. And so what kind of recommendations can we give parents? When I heard that from years ago, the first thing I went to is my son Chase and said, "Don't ever do this. Don't ever do this. Don't ever do this." But what would you suggest? And have you even encountered this yourself in your practice?
Oh yeah, yeah. Yes, I have encountered it. There's um someone who writes very poignantly about it, a guy called Nick Dubin, who experienced it personally, and he's a sort of very articulate and interesting guy. And so he's written a book about his
Oh,
experience. He's an autism self-advocate, but he's written a book about this whole topic. And it's it's a really there are a lot of things going on. It's a really complicated situation.
yeah.
Um, Not the least. I mean, part of the issue is that I think that the legal system has this kind of formula which assumes that if you're looking at something like that, you're at a very, very high risk for hands-on offending. And so that's part of the calculation that's kind of
Okay.
buried in, even if it's not explicit, that's what is in people's minds. And so
Okay.
the sentences can be longer than the sentences for hands-on offending. So if we're looking at something on your computer, which you're not, which is illegal to look at, you can end up spending more time incarcerated than for a hands-on offense in some situations. That's of course not the case in all situations, but it does happen. And there are a lot of things to think about. For a start, pornography itself is a very complicated thing, and there are all sorts of cues which are confusing to typical people,
Right.
let alone neurodivergent people. And there's kind of acting out of all sorts of inappropriate behaviors for porn content, and acting out of situations which couldn't possibly happen in real life without people getting in trouble.
Right.
And so some people watch it and they have the capacity to say this is a dramatization, and this is
Right.
for a specific purpose. And so I understand that this is not okay, but other people are watching it and they don't really understand that distinction in the same way. And so I think the society bears responsibility for a lot of this issue. I mean, I see it as a kind of almost a public health crisis
Right.
with a particular population which has vulnerabilities, which is in a sense drawing out the issue, but really, like, it's we as a society need to do something about it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and there are people who do, autistic people who knowingly do the wrong thing, but
Right.
they often, if for autistic people, for any person, these situations are complicated. No one wants to be sitting in front of a computer looking at the stuff. This is not what people choose for their life, and
Right.
so it's usually sad, um, difficult, unfortunate situations which are kind of surfacing with these
Right.
legal issues. So I think it's a really big and complicated topic.
Very complicated. So, Dr. Westphal, so in your experience, what do you see as the most common legal issue in the autism world?
I can't. The problem is, once you get a type of case and you do an okay or a good job with it, you get more of those cases. And so
Mm,
it's difficult from my perspective to
I
really
understand. Yeah.
understand, to know exactly what's going on. But I think from a kind of categorically speaking perspective, like the issue is usually related to sort of not understanding the impact or the way in which one's behaviors will be perceived. And that applies to the images of child exploitation thing we were talking about before.
Right.
Like, if you don't understand what the ramifications of
Right.
being arrested and having your name splayed on a
Mm,
offender registry for a decade or whatever it is.
Wow.
If you don't really sort of understand that in a visceral sense, like that you're in a different situation. And I think that's also true of people who make threatening statements, sometimes not really sort of meaning any harm, but there's a for example, someone who's offended by you know false advertising, advertisements which are inaccurate, and sort of thinks they're calling people to task, but then ends up crossing a line which is interpreted as sort of threatening behavior. Situations like that. But when it boils down to it, it's again about social insight, and sometimes about kind of restricted repetitive patterns of behavior.
Right.
That can be a component too, like in the case I was talking about earlier about the guy with the train.
The repetitive, right? So what type of recommendations you have for families about how to prepare so that legal situation doesn't escalate?
Yep. Well, I think preparation on so many different levels. So if it's more difficult if you live in a big community like a city. It's easier if you live in a small community, because in a small community you can have personal relationships with the first responders, law enforcement, and but that said, you can also there are a number of different strategies, and there are sort of books about this. I mean, Dennis Debo, I don't know if you've encountered him, but he's both a ex-cop, and the parent of someone with an autistic person.
Oh, from Connecticut.
I don't know where he's. Yeah,
No.
I don't know. Maybe he's from Connecticut, but he writes. He writes about sort of a number of very practical strategies.
Different person. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, some people carry like identification cards which say, have written out what's going on, so they can just like reach into their pocket and pull it out and show the police officer. I also think, as parents, it's people put their heads in the sand sometimes, in part because, maybe with the computer, their kid has found something which is keeping them occupied, and they're quiet and things are under control, and so they just sort of leave it in peace and don't pay too much attention. And I think situations can kind of emerge from that, and so it's not anyone's fault. It's not a parent's fault, but I also think that really, like what you said before, really sort of laying it out in very concrete terms, like this is why you don't do this. This is where you don't go on the internet. You need to talk with me about anything which is ambiguous. And so keeping a kind of, rather than being just kind of absolutely rule bound, having the capacity to have an open conversation about it with the person you're looking out for, I think is a really important thing. So having a good line of communication is critical.
I definitely agree with that. I always walk in on Chase, see what he's looking at on the computer. And nowadays, when you have, he's looking at cartoons on the computer, but on the side, you have a woman that's showing, a cartoon woman showing her chest. And I'm like, what's that? He's like, oh, Mom, no, I'm not looking at that. So, it's hard. So you have to explain to them certain things, that don't do this, don't do that, don't touch this person, they don't touch you. And it's challenging, because it's a lot of don'ts you're telling them, because it should be a natural, they are kind of know already, but it's not the same for our loved ones. And I feel bad, like, well, don't do this, don't do that. It's challenging. But yeah, I think also I always share with parents that no matter where you live, bring your child to the police department. Introduce yourself to them, let them know your child's on a spectrum. I think that's very effective. So once they have the face of your child, and they know what some of their their challenges are, they know how to better respond. In Connecticut, in Waterbury, I worked with a police chief, and we have they're in the system. So if they get a phone call, they fill out a form with some of the challenges that the child may have. So when they get a phone call, they know what they're going to be driving into. And so, that's important. I think it's just important about communication and understanding on both sides.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of conversation. We went from autism, you can't say high level, you can't say severe. It's just so many things. And there's autistics, and then there's neurodivergent, there's neurodiversity. So what do you think about neurodiversity?
I mean, I think neurodiversity is the motor which keeps people interesting.
Yeah.
That's without neurodiversity, we'd be a bunch of clones marching around. And so to me, it's a very, very important thing. I love the neurodiversity movement. I love the self-advocacy movement. And I think that the idea that there are things which in some situations are assets, but in other situations are really sort of can lead to problems is a really important concept. And, we have like psychiatrists, medicine loves to pathologize things. This is a disorder, this is a disease, this is a categorically good or bad or whatever. But I think that's not the way people actually work, particularly when we're talking about sort of subtle things like autism. And so recognizing that there are, all sorts, and that there are all sorts of kind of issues which come up, but all sorts of amazing things which can also be contributed is, I think, really, really important. And I think we're moving in a good direction as a kind of society with respect to that.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with the neurodivergent community, the self-advocates in this in particular. The only challenge I have with the self-advocates is that they're not inclusive of others who are not at that level on the spectrum.
No, sure.
They're not inclusive of individuals who parents still have to put diapers on them at the age of 30, or whose child is banging her banging her head and biting their wrists, because they can't communicate. And so I agree with a lot of things they say, but sometimes they leave out the others, which is always interesting to me because they want everybody to accept them. So that's only a challenge I have sometimes with that self advocates, because sometimes it's not including my child.
Yeah. No, and I mean, my work before I became involved with this legal stuff was with a kind of regressive autism and a condition called childhood disintegrative disorder, which ends up with very, very, people end up with massive sort of intellectual disabilities and not often nonverbal and
Right.
unable to take care of their basic needs. And you talk to one of those parents, and they're not, they see things very differently than and someone. I mean, Elon Musk is on everyone, but there's again a huge range, and with that, with at risk of getting into a topic which I have an awful lot to say about, and I think there's an awful lot to be said about. I mean, I do think that the kind of spectrum analogy is an analogy, and like all the colors and the spectra are really nice,
Right.
but what the implication that it all comes back to a single sort of source is completely inaccurate. So to think that all autism is, ultimately the same at its core, I think is really the wrong way of thinking about things.
Right.
And so I think there's a kind of, in the metaphor, there's a thing which is a bit confusing. But that said, I think there are, there are nonverbal people who've contributed amazing things to the world. I mean, I'm just thinking to Stephen Wiltshire, who's he's an adult now, but he's defined as having an intellectual disability. He has autism, but he has the capacity when he's flown over a city to draw it after seeing it for an hour.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Stuff like that. Like,
Yeah.
We know you and we could spend the rest of our lives trying to do that, and we could never even come close.
No,
And I mean, I don't know that you couldn't, but I
can't.
know I could. I don't know anyone who can. So there's something different about the way in which he's processing the world, and we need like that. That is I mean, a treasure trove from the perspective of understanding how the mind works.
To me, and that there's so many of skill sets like that. It's just simply amazing. Like this even understanding sports, and they could break every sport down, but because of some of their social challenges, they're not going to be hired for a job, and they could work. They're brilliant people that could do so much, and they're just being overseen. But back to law, because I'll start spewing off on different things. So, what is your what can you say that you just put a smile on your face that you did it in terms of the law and autism?
Oh, it's that's an interesting question, because I mean, there are cases I've been involved with where I'm just like, I know that what the outcome was altered because of bringing the kind of understanding of what the condition contributed to the situation, to the legal system's perspective. And that, there's a lot of ambiguity in legal situations, and I've been involved with cases that I wouldn't like to be involved with again. But I've also been involved with cases where I'm like, this was the right and a really, really good outcome. I've also been involved with cases where I don't think I helped, even though I'm absolutely convinced it was the right thing to try to present it from the perspective of the condition. So I don't have a good answer for that, but
It's not like a good answer to me.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Alexander Westphal, for taking your time out to discuss with us the law and autism. It's an important topic, and I'm sure you probably get a lot of questions. And you can also visit, you're on the website of the Yale website, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll have that information at the end of the session. And thank you so much for taking your evening to speak with me.
Oh, thank you. No, and it was a real pleasure. You make it really pleasant interview. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Good night. Bye-bye.